And we're back, Penn State football fans, on the blue-white breakdown. We did a lot of podcasts this week. I think, well, Johnny did, you did. I did a couple, but it's we're going to talk signing day, Penn State signing day. We're going to talk Penn State, Oregon, some practice notes. Max wants to get to some things that Penn State tech subscribers have on their minds, and the guy takes detailed notes. So get ready, subscribers. You're going to get some info. But Max Ralph is joining me. It's late Thursday, December 5th, 2 days away from the Big Ten title game. Penn State, Oregon, out at Lucas Oil Stadium in Indianapolis. Max and I are going. Johnny McGonigal's going. Joe Hermit's going to go. So make sure you guys, PennLive's going to have a lot of stuff on this game, before and after and during. So we're both excited. But Max, you've had yourself quite a week between recruiting, between the Big Ten title game, between, it's just been, it was kind of a crazy week, because it was a week we didn't really see coming in terms of the Big Ten title game. And whatever your workload was because of signing day got doubled or close to tripled. So I'm glad you made it to Thursday. Hopefully you can survive to Saturday and Sunday, but I know it's been a challenging week for you.
Hey, Bob, don't forget that the transfer portal is up next after all of that. So
it's like December 9th, right? Yeah.
That's right. Next Monday. It's not going to stop anytime soon, but it was fun. Signing day was a long day, get about a 7, 8 a.m. start and go through noon and then cover practice last night. But we're here, Bob. We're ready. I'm certainly ready for a trip to Indianapolis this weekend. Going to be a fun one.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, just taking it day by day, as James Franklin would love to say. So
that's all you can do, Max, in early December when you got signing day and the Big Ten title game, and a pretty lengthy trip to Indianapolis, all kind of smushed together in about 4 or 5 days. So all you can do, Max, take it day by day. But we got to start somewhere on this Blue White Breakdown podcast. Why don't we just start? We're going to get into signing day pretty heavily, but let's just start. Since you were at practice, you got a couple. I think you got at least one story up on PennLive. You have some injury updates, maybe some other things for us, but let's just start with what you learned from the Penn State practice availability on Wednesday night.
Yeah, I think James Franklin was pretty illuminating in his thoughts on Oregon, which was nice because we only talked to him on Sunday this week instead of Monday, and he hadn't watched the film yet and wasn't really giving us much info about the Oregon Ducks. So he talked well last night, a lot of good stuff about Dylan Gabriel. Really actually had kind of great thoughts, in my opinion, on the chess match, as he called it, with up front having to defend Jordan Birch and Mateo Uyunglele up front. And so I plan on writing about that later today, this Thursday. So keep an eye out. But as far as this stuff we actually saw in practice, it was fairly light, but, important stuff. Trey Wallace looked to be full go. He didn't play against Maryland. Same goes for Elliott Washington, who has not played for 2 weeks now. Yeah. Those guys, Wallace, their top receiver, and Washington, probably their third best cornerback. So really important pieces that I asked James Franklin, are they confident they'll go? He said, yes, it's a high level of confidence right now that they will be available. So all good news on that front. And the last thing that I made mention of in my practice story on PennLive, I remain really impressed by Tyseer Denmark. I've caught some flack for picking him over the past couple of weeks in our.
He did get a touchdown. You did say he was going to score.
He did. I just think
he ran it up, Max, but it still counts.
It does for him, yeah. But I just think he's a really twitchy guy. Even if it's not this season, I think he's gonna be pretty good on the outside in the receiver spot.
Yeah. I wanted to touch on one thing you said, because I'm kind of in agreement. I think that I'm not talking about Harrison Wallace. I think a healthy Elliott Washington, if he is healthy, is kind of a big deal in this game when you talk about Oregon's speed, the pieces they have they can put out on the field. And what you said, I think, carries a lot of weight. I think if you really watched Elliott Washington play this year, a lot of Penn State fans will remember that pretty questionable call, I think, against Elliott in the Ohio State game. I believe it was him that extended the drive. But he made a nice play on that play, and he's the guy that's very active and he's very disruptive as a corner, and he's a young player. And I do think that had he not been dealing with something, Max, this last couple of weeks, I think you're right. I think after you get past Harris and Kimber, Cam Miller, maybe he's kind of right there. He is kind of right there as a key contributor in the secondary because of his tools, because of his confidence, because of his aggressiveness. I don't know if he's all the way back, but I think when you look at Penn State's defense, I think Elliott Washington moving forward, especially next year and the year after that, he's definitely a player to watch. And if he's healthy against Oregon, I think absolutely Tom Allen and Terry Smith are going to have him out there.
Yeah, well, Elliott, if you want to tie this into signing day, he's a guy who they flipped from Alabama way back when. He was a huge win on the recruiting trail, and he's just kind of gotten better in his 2 years every day since he got here. Played some special teams last year, and now this year has been thrown to the fire and has done really well. I agree with you. I think he's probably their third best corner because if you look at what Cam Miller and Zion Tracy have done, those two guys are both good. And they've played well, but they're playing a little bit more of that nickel spot. So I think Elliott Washington on the true outside corner spot is probably their third best guy. So I
just remember Zane Durant talking to me before the start of the season. We were talking about the fastest guys on the team.
Yes.
And I think you had referenced it to a podcast before. So I said, Zane, Elliott Washington, is he the fastest guy? He's like, I'll give you the top three. And he was like, Elliott Washington, Omari Evans. And he said, Davian Collins. And I'm like, all right. Davian Collins is another one, I think, that has really made some strides in the last 3 games. I believe he had a pick against Maryland, but I'm telling you, this corner room is good. Very, very deep. And they do have a lot of play. And I think that's going to be a really big deal in this game. They have to be able to substitute because they cannot wear down against this Oregon attack, especially if they go tempo. They're going to need a lot of corners to try and slow this team down, Max.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Washington used to have some battles with Daquan Hardy last year as for who was the fastest guy. And I'm pretty sure Washington beat him in a race, if I'm remembering the story correctly. But I do know they raced at some point last year.
Yeah. All right, Max. So I said we briefly chat about practice, but I got carried away. I apologize. We're about 8 minutes in on the Blue White Breakdown. We got to get to signing day. It's a big class that Penn State coach James Franklin and his assistants and everyone else in the program that's involved in recruiting have landed that plane. It's a big plane, right, when it comes to recruiting. So you have a bunch of stuff on PennLive. It was a crazy day. But Penn State's really good at closing the deal. I mean, almost every year, there's very few surprises in a bad way when it comes to Penn State on signing day. And they do manage to flip some kids, either in the home stretch or I think in the case of this week, they had a late ad too. I don't know if you want to talk about the late ad or you want to talk about some of the things that also struck you on signing day, but wherever you want to start, the floor is yours, man.
I mean, I would love, we don't have the time for it, but I would love to talk about all 26 kids because I think in every situation, there's something interesting about each guy this year. But there's a lot to go off of with this class because you mentioned, they're really good at closing the deal on guys. But, with that said, they lost one of their top prospects last week to Florida. It was a guy, a 4-star edge rusher. I think he was officially their third best prospect in the class. Yeah. And, it was a guy who I'd talked to a few times and seemed really solid.
You read a story about him?
Yeah, I sure did. And I texted him and I was like, hey, man, thanks for the time. Here's the story. And then 3 days later, he flipped to Florida. And it's like, oh, well, okay. I mean, he was a nice kid and he seemed pretty solid in his Penn State commitment. But, obviously things change fast in recruiting.
Yeah, that's my takeaway. Something happened real fast.
Yeah, you mentioned the guy they flipped this week. I do think that's an interesting place to start because he was a 3-star tight end Brian Kortovich from Cleveland, who I haven't gotten a chance to really watch the tape on him yet, but I do know the staff likes him. He played some wide receiver in his high school career, has a big frame. He's up at 6'4". He'll easily be able to add to that once he gets here. And, anybody that Ty Howell brings into that tight end room, I think is worth keeping an eye on because they've just continually churned dudes out of that room. I think it's interesting because, probably the biggest name left on the board for Penn State right now, maybe the second biggest is Andrew Olesh, who plays over at Southern Lehigh, in-state talent. He's turned into the number one player in Pennsylvania late in this class. Penn State still wants him at tight end. Yes, they've signed 2 tight ends in this class, Matt Henderson and Brian Kortovich, just this week. They have 2 tight ends, but if Olesh wants to come, they are still going to take him. James Franklin made like a very subtly public pitch to Olesh the other day when asked about the work that Ty Howell has done for that position group. And, right now Olesh is committed to Michigan. Wolverines just got Bryce Underwood, the number 1 quarterback in the 2025 class. I know that he just took a late visit to Oregon as well in the season and has not signed yet. I think the plan is for him to sign in the early period, but he hasn't signed yet. So I think Penn State is still alive. I can't really say much on what their chances are specifically. I thought on the surface getting Kortovich was a bad sign for their chances with Olesh. But, we'll see. Like I said, a lot changes fast in recruiting. So that is one to keep an eye on through the rest of this week. And, there are more guys out there potentially for, the rest of this week and the February period, which I've written a little bit about on PennLive. You can go find it there in my recruiting content. But that's where we stand right now.
Yeah. You mentioned that guy, that big tight end that's still out there, Southern Lehigh, Max. That's the Lehigh Valley kid. Here's my philosophy on that. Whenever in any walk of life, in any profession, you get a chance to add somebody from the Lehigh Valley to your team or your staff, you got to do it because it's going to pay off. Now, I might be talking about me. I might not be talking about me, but I'm just a big, big fan of anyone from the Lehigh Valley. So I'm going to be watching this play out. And I just wanted to add one thing about Kortovich. I helped you like about 3%. I did about 3% of your signing day work for you. Happy to do it. I wrote a couple of stories on some kids after they signed. But what I was listening to the live stream and how it's pretty fascinating to watch James it's like a car wash, how he they roll him in and roll him out. And but he makes sure he gets to certain things and he doesn't miss anything. And it's genuine. And you could tell he's always got a smile on his face. But I was watching it for a good chunk of signing day morning. But when he got to Kortovich, what struck me was what he said, because it still bugs him that there's so many quote unquote tight end prospects that just have no interest in blocking, whether it's in high school or at some point it actually happens. It still happens in college. Penn State's had some tight ends that were ballyhooed that just have not emerged. And I think a lot of that has to do with maybe the physical approach to the game. But he said, this guy, for all of his talent, has a blue collar mentality, is not afraid to stick his nose in there. So that to me resonated, and you can't have enough of those guys either. And this seems like a guy that if he continues to develop, add some weight, gets a little bit better, maybe all around, is a guy that Penn State's really going to like because they do really value versatile tight ends who will show up in the run game.
Yep, and it was a late flip from Purdue. He'd been committed for a few months, and Purdue fired Ryan Walters. He came to campus for the Maryland game, and boom, he's a Penn State commit. So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's just like James in any given press conference. You can kind of read through the weeds of certain things that he says, and I think the way that he addressed Kortovich and his versatility is a key thing to watch for sure. And I think he'll be one of the interesting ones to watch in this class because he flipped so late. But there's a lot of interesting things here.
Max, I know we're going to get to PennLive's Penn State text subscribers. They had some questions and comments for you in a little bit. But why don't we just do this? Since we're about 15 minutes in, you mentioned a lot of interesting kids. Can you maybe just talk about 2 or 3 in your opinion, whether it's what you've watched or what you've learned in talking to them, that have really kind of stuck out to you in terms of maybe, hey, these are a couple of guys that they don't necessarily have to be the highest ranked kids in the class. These are a couple of guys that in a couple of years, Penn State fans are going to know all about.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, there's a lot to like about all the kids in this class, to be honest with you. And we got the chance, we got to chat for about an hour with recruiting staffers yesterday, Andy Frank, Alan Zamitis, Kenny Sanders, and they were really, really good on the process of getting some of these kids and what about each of them stood out. So I think that, go check out what I wrote today, this morning. I kind of analyzed some of the class. I will preface all of this by saying this is the worst class ratings wise Franklin has signed since 2021, which was a class heavily impacted by coronavirus and not being able to recruit properly and everything. So there are good pieces in this class. You have to remember that Penn State is going to need to develop some of these guys because on the pure talent scale, this might be a little bit below where they're used to being, a few spots. So that is key to remember in this place. That there's going to be some guys that they got to develop as always, but maybe a few more this year than we're used to. I would say that the number one guy that we keep hearing about over and over and over and over again is Chaz Coleman, the defensive end from Cleveland, Ohio, who was additionally a late ad, just like Kordovich. Kind of funny that they come from the same area too, not the same school. But Coleman is going to be a defensive end at Penn State. He's got a 6'5" frame. He's going to put some weight on and be great. I believe he's a summer enrollee, but he played all over the place in high school, played some tight end, played some quarterback. I think it was Zamitis who was saying that, or it might have been Frank who was saying that, you put on his quarterback film and he's throwing great balls out there too. But he's just a freaky athlete. He can dunk with the best of them in basketball. And every time his name gets brought up with any of those recruiting staffers, they are just stoked to have him. That's who they're really excited about. I labeled him in my story the steal of the class. Just because Ohio State tried to make a late push for him too. Penn State got him right after he visited for the whiteout. Ohio State offered him the next week and then tried to get him on campus at the end of the month. Didn't happen. He signed with Penn State. Beating Ohio State for an in-state prospect is really tough to do. So, props to Penn State for that. He's a guy who I like. And, just in terms of guys who I think could potentially play early, which this is a question from Matt McClenahan.
All right, here we go. I love it.
And I appreciate the question. I always keep my eyes on defensive backs because Terry Smith always brings in guys who are athletic and ready to go early, and he's really good at developing them early too. You can guarantee that at least one or two defensive backs are going to play on special teams next year. Yeah. Darius Dixon, the top-rated recruit in the class, outside of the typical footprint going out to Mater Dei in California, he's a really physical, well-built prospect, probably their most polished guy so far in this class because of playing against the schedule that he does at Mater Dei. And he could play some safety, he could play some DB or CB, sorry. And, it's kind of to be determined exactly where he goes, but he's a guy I could see getting on the field, as well as Jameer Joseph, who was Alan Zamitis' top guy on this board based on what I heard him say. He's got that mentality of a lockdown corner that you want to hear. Apparently, this is a funny story that I didn't include in my writing online, but Zamitis said they were going through the film and he was texting with Joseph and said, "Hey, I think you let up only one catch this season in 10 games I've seen of you." And apparently Jameer texted him back and said, nah, coach, that wasn't me. I didn't get a catch on me. So apparently they really love the tools that he has and especially the mentality. Some of the 3-star defensive backs, Braz Thomas and Josh Johnson, a little bit more raw as prospects, but they do like the physicality and the versatility there. And then, of course, I think wide receiver is a position that could get some run early because none of these guys are surefire hits, in my opinion, from what I've seen so far. But I do think that there's a lot of potential in all 4 of the guys that they signed. and 3 of them are getting on campus early in January. That's number one key for getting on the field in the fall, is being on campus early as a wide receiver, because you got to learn the playbook.
Yep.
That's part of it. I think based on what we heard yesterday, Matthew Outen from Virginia probably has the best chance of playing.
Yeah.
He's about 6'1", 200 pounds, pretty speedy. He runs track, but just a versatile guy who can do a little bit of everything. Probably going to play more than one receiver position at Penn State, if I had to guess. I talked to his coach over the summer and just raved about him. Was originally committed to Virginia Tech, but Zemaitis again said, like, we were watching this kid's film and everybody in the room kind of had the same things to say about him. He's a guy we needed. And so interesting win again. I think that Lyric Samuel, who's been committed forever, is a really interesting prospect too, because he's 6'4", but he's only 175 pounds right now. So as soon as he gets into the weight training and the nutrition at Penn State and everything, things could change pretty fast. Kenny Sanders thinks he might be the most dynamic player in this class, or one of the most dynamic players in this class. But, there's going to be an adjustment period for sure with a body like that. So those are my that's a very long-winded answer, Bob, but
not at all.
That's where I stand right now.
All right. Before we wrap up this blue-white breakdown and get ready for Penn State, Oregon at Lucas Oil Stadium, was there any other tech subscriber that you thought, hey, I want to address this? We're running out of time, but I like the question. I like the way you wrote it. I like the cut of his jib, or I like the cut of her jib, and I want to give her a shout out. Is anyone else on your radar before we roll out of here?
Yes, 2 very quick ones I will hit as well as I can. From Lou Z, it's the age-old question: is NIL affecting Penn State's ability to land higher rated prospects? Yes. I mean, cut and dry. Yes. Like, it's going to. Penn State is I would say competitive from everything we hear, but it's certainly not on the top level yet. Like a Michigan and Ohio State, Oregon is those teams of the Big Ten are really making some noise. They're just not on that level. They're and Andy Frank actually did have a worthwhile comment yesterday that I think readers would want to hear, is just that he said, look, we're competitive, basically, is what he said. Like, I'm paraphrasing, but he was basically like, we're competitive, like NIL is a thing, but if a kid only cares about NIL, we are probably not the right school for them, which, you don't necessarily, you're probably not going to hear those exact words from some of those programs that are doing NIL at the highest level. So, and I think it's worthwhile. I think Penn State has taken a good approach considering their circumstances. Lou's second part of the question: is there a difference between a number 5 class and a number 17 class, for example? Yes, there is. I mean, it's kind of, it is one of those things where, like, you might get some more early contributors with that number 5 class and some more talent, but Penn State has shown it over the past few years. And while this is like a lower rated class for James Franklin, in the past couple of years, they've been 14, 15 and still turned out some young guys who are contributing right away from those classes. So there's a difference. It's gonna mean something, but with the transfer portal and the way that Penn State has been able to immediately fill holes, I'd worry a little bit less about the number. I think it's important for some reasons, and like, it can be kind of a litmus test of recruiting success, but it is not the end all be all. Jeff High, a regular responder for these things, asked about a quick overview of the offensive line and D lines in this class. I really, really like Malachi Goodman. I love what Penn State did to get him. They see him as an offensive tackle. He was their top-rated prospect behind Darius Dixon, who I talked about at length.
Yeah, he's just a baby too. He could tell he's real young. He's gonna, once he starts to fill out, look out.
Yeah. I mean, you literally just look at the pictures we have online, Bob. He
looks like a cub, like a bear cub. And I mean that in a good way. He looks like, boy, this guy's gonna fill out. He could be a problem.
Yeah. Our sister site NJ.com has some stuff of him on the field, and he looks good in the uniform. Like, you look at some of the pictures, and he looks like he's already playing in college. He's like 6'6", a little over 3 bills, and is a guy who Kenny Sanders was super excited about. I think that was a big recruiting win too, because his recruitment went all the way into September after he officially visited in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
It was a guy who they'd been on for a long time, and he was looking at the Alabamas, the Georgias,
Yep.
the USCs. This is a big win, and I think he's a guy that could contribute sooner than later. Offensive line is hard to play as a freshman, but sooner than later, I'd give him. Across the rest of the offensive line, there are some interesting projects, I think, with Owen Alasini, who is another lengthy offensive tackle that they'll probably need to fill out. Brady O'Hara, recruited as a tight end originally, is going to play some offensive tackle. He just keeps growing. He's up to 6'6" now, so depending on how that body fills out will be interesting. And Michael Troutman is there on the interior as well. He's definitely an interior guy, a little bit smaller, 6'2"-ish. Interesting offensive line group, but Malachi Goodman, for a lot of reasons, is the guy that sticks out. D-line, we already talked about Coleman, the edge rusher, who is getting a lot of love. One thing that I will say with this defensive line group, don't forget that Max Granville was supposed to be a part of this, and he's already on campus. So you can almost kind of add him into what Penn State has done in this recruiting class, because he was supposed to be here next year, but it just reclassified, and he looks really freaking good. I saw him up close in person the other day, and he's way too big for a 17, 18-year-old. But so he's a good one. Coleman's a good one. I think there's another interesting project piece with Cortez Harris, who has some good stuff on film, dealt with a little bit of injury his senior year out of Maryland, but needs to put on some weight, and will do so once you get here. James Franklin told him on the live stream, I think you're going to be a monster once you get into our training program. Interesting guy. Ivan Kamaju, I don't know how to say it for sure. They kept saying he had some of the best stats of a senior in this class. Another guy out of Maryland. I think they see him as an edge rusher right now, but he's a guy that feels like he could swing a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I might be missing a name. I apologize if I am, but the last one I want to hit on is Randy Adarica, who is their only real true interior defensive lineman. It's a guy from Florida, had to pluck him from Miami Central, who is a national program. And the thing that Kenny Sanders said about him that he loved about the fact that he played in a national program is that he was playing against these top talents everywhere else. He's gonna, his recruiting story is maybe gonna remind some people of Zane Durant, who has become such a problem right now for Penn State. He's a little bit on the smaller side, 6'2", sub 300 guy. Comes from Florida like Durant. Yep. It was a 3-star prospect, but he's been incredibly productive playing a national schedule at Miami Central. I've got on Max Preps that he had 17 sacks the past 2 years. Tyler Donahue over at 24/7 Sports said he had 20. So, whichever number is correct, he's been really productive playing some tough teams over in Florida. So I think that's a guy who could fly under the radar. I don't have any projections about when he could play at Penn State, but depending on how his development goes, certainly an interesting one. He'll be an early enrollee. So I think in total, I think Penn State's work in the trenches in this class is interesting. I think they have a couple of guys that they feel really, really good about in Goodman and Coleman. But I think that there could be maybe not concern, but you're a little iffy right now on whether those groups perfectly pan out, because you don't have many of those surefire prospects that we've seen in the past few years.
Now that, Penn State fans, is a thorough, and I do mean thorough, breakdown. Max, that was really well done. I think informative. I like the fact that you praised some players, but also you did note that, hey, it's not a top 10 class. It's probably not their best one since 2021. So you gave them a little tough love. I think that's necessary, but you hit on some high notes. I like, if you're a Penn State fan, it was a balanced report, I thought. So, and plus you mentioned a kid from Southern Lehigh, which is
that's
another.
What we're here for, Bob.
That's the whole key. All right, Max, we got to roll. We got to travel, man. We got to at some point we have to get all the way out to Indianapolis. I know it's been a busy week for you. We've had, I think we have 4 podcasts this week. It's going to keep rolling right into next week, because no matter what happens in the Big Ten title game, Penn State's got at least one more game after that to play. Max mentioned the transfer portal's coming up. There's going to be some NFL decisions or decisions to stay. There's so much to get into once the regular season ends, and it doesn't really stop until, I don't know, February. So stick with us, Penn State fans here on PennLive. Keep listening to our podcast. You can review us, rate us. Tech subscribers, don't be afraid to shout a couple questions and comments at us as well. We can do those on podcast too. Max, I know you look like you're ready for a trip to the Big Ten title game. It feels like you're ready. Are you ready to see Penn State, Oregon?
I'm always ready, Bob. Put me on the field.
All right. That's good enough for me. That's good enough for all our listeners too. Guys, we'll be at the game. We're going to have plenty of stuff to get to on PennLive, and we'll have a lot of podcasts next week.